my goal this morning is to share some of the experience I've kind of built up over the last 8 years helping organisations successfully adopt public cloud services. And as Neil's mentioned, I've been on both sides of the fence. I've both been a customer of the public cloud providers, but I've kind of also worked in partnership with them as a consulting and managed service partner as well over that period of time. But before we get into the challenges, I just wanted to kind of start with the why. And again, I'm hoping that most of you listening this morning will hopefully recognise that cloud has become the new norm. Most organisations across most sectors are either taking advantage of public cloud today or considering taking advantage of public cloud in the near future. And that's for a range of drivers. And I'm not going to get into the drivers in too much detail this morning, 4 of which are on the screen in front of you. These are the 4 that come up on a regular basis through the conversations that I have, but I recognise there's a wider set of drivers outside those as well. It could be a technology refresh or a data centre exit as well, triggering the drive towards public cloud. However, it's not without its challenges, and yes, there are a wide range of technical challenges that every organisation will face on that journey, and I'm not going to focus on these this morning, but instead I want to focus on 4 other tough challenges that I believe should be part of every cloud migration program that every organisation considers running. The 4 challenges I want to focus on this morning are all interrelated in some capacity. I want to focus a little bit around operating model, looking at the organisational change that you need to factor into a cloud migration program. And it's not just the technology operating model, there is an impact to wider parts of the business as well. Skills enablement. Skills is probably the single biggest challenge facing every organisation. There's not enough skill to satisfy the demand in the market today, but there are things you can do to make that challenge just a slightly bit easier. Financial management. Organisations are shifting from a CapEx to a variable OpEx model, and that variable OpEx model comes with a set of new challenges. And again, we'll drill down a little bit on those. And then we'll finish off by focusing a little bit on security and compliance. And while security and compliance is less of a blocker today than it was in the past, there are things that you need to factor into your cloud migration program to ensure that you're protecting your systems and data going forward as well. So let's jump into operating model to start with. For me, every organisation needs to consider changes to the operating model as part of a cloud migration program. A cloud migration program just isn't a technology program. It's not moving services from A to B. In order to successfully operate the services in the target environment, there'll be changes to organisation structure, particularly within the technology organisation, changes to processes and procedures. And in some cases, you will need to implement new processes and procedures, new tools, and obviously new skills. And again, that's across both the technology and different parts of the business as well. You also need to recognise that there'll be an interim state. You don't migrate all of your workload at the flick of a switch. For a period of time, you will need your existing operating model to continue to run to migrate the service, to operate the services that haven't been migrated, as well as your future operating model that will need to coexist for a period of time to support those services that have been successfully migrated. And that interim state in some cases can last days, weeks, or months, depending on the size of the environment you're migrating and the degree of transformation that you're delivering as part of that as well. Failure, in my experience, to recognise the need to transform the operating model will absolutely have an impact on benefit. It will also slow down the migration program as you bring in additional scope and you try to get additional stakeholders on board as well. Worst case, again, I've seen the risk of this materialise in some organisations. It can cause a cloud migration program to fail and you need to start again. I guess the key thing for me is you need to recognise that you need to take teams across the business on the journey. It's just not a technology change. There are teams across the wider business, and that's from the executive team all the way down. You need to take them on the journey with you. I want to kind of drill into some examples of some of the changes that you might need to consider as part of this journey. I'm going to start with the technology organisation and then move on to the business. If you look at the technology organisation, first off, you need to recognise that as part of the migration to cloud, in this future state, you're going to and need to exploit higher levels of automation. You're going to be defining the infrastructure that you need to provision in any of the services on top of that as code. Therefore, your IT systems administrators or engineers need to think and operate more like software developers in the future. They need to be able to write software. That's infrastructure as code that defines the infrastructure and then the services that you're going to provision and then maintain. They need to become familiar with a new set of tools, source code management tools, continuous integration tools to support and deliver against this future state. That also then drives changes to some of your existing IT delivery processes and some of the tooling that you use. We've talked about some of the tooling changes. But again, when you adopt public cloud and you're using concepts such as auto-scaling, there's an impact to monitoring. And that sounds pretty basic, but there is an impact to monitoring. In a traditional data center environment, if a virtual machine fails or it is terminated, your ops teams get an alert, they engage and they look to recover that service. In a public cloud world, a virtual machine terminating could be expected behavior. It could be that you've automatically provisioned more capacity to support with demand and you're terminating some of that capacity when that demand subsided. So how does your monitoring tools know what's an expected termination and therefore I ignore that, don't raise an alert, and actually what is an unexpected termination and I want to go and wake someone up? Again, a change to tooling requires a level of increased sophistication. Asset and config management. A lot of cloud resources, depending on the level of transformation that you undertake on that journey, become more transient in nature. They're not long-lived, they're more short-lived, they come and go. Therefore, there's a significant impact to asset and config management. You can't continue to do that manually if that's how you do that today. You need to look at how you automatically discover the resources that you're deploying and maintaining over a period of time. And then simple things like patch management. If you think of patching a virtual machine, again, every month, the operating system vendor will release a set of patches. You layer those patches in over the set that you deployed last month, and you'll continue to do that for a number of years until that system is decommissioned. Now, yes, you can still apply that principle in a public cloud environment for certain workloads, but for other workloads, those that are more transient in nature, you may require a slightly different approach. So, for example, some of the customers that I've worked with, rather than adding in the patches each month, what we do is we create a new golden image. And actually, we redeploy all of their infrastructure on a monthly basis. So we tear down what they've got and redeploy a new infrastructure with the latest patched image. Obviously, we do that without any service disruption, but again, a slightly different approach to IT processes that you run today. If you then look at organization structure, you need to focus on breaking down the traditional silos that exist within an organization today. You've typically got a server team, a storage team and a network team. And these three teams operate independently, typically behind obscure manual processes. There's lots of manual handoffs between these teams, slowing the rate of change down and causing a lot of frustration to the teams that interact with them. In your future state, you need multi-skilled and multidisciplinary teams. If you look at the cloud engineer of the future, when a cloud engineer is provisioning cloud resources, they need to understand server, because they're provisioning an operating system in some cases. They're also provisioning the storage and configuring that storage, so they need to understand storage as well. That server will need to be connected to a network. They'll be performing that activity. They'll be configuring the firewall rules. And as I've said, they also need to be developers. They're doing all of this as code. So you're kind of moving from that traditional I-shaped person that then maybe became a T-shaped person to someone that's more comb-shaped. They've got a level of expertise around a number of different disciplines in order to successfully provision and manage and maintain public cloud services. So breaking down the silos and changing the shape of the resource that exists within your IT organization. The final one that I'm going to talk about, and again, it's one that a lot of organizations don't think about, and that's the funding of change and run. In most organizations, the run function is a very, very small light team, just enough to keep the lights on. And a lot of the change activity is funded separately through program and project budgets. Now, it doesn't suggest that that approach changes wholesale, but what I've seen work and be very, very effective is kind of moving towards more of a product team approach. Some people call this a cloud center of excellence. I prefer to go with a cloud engineering product team, but this is having a team that can not only keep the lights on, but has the capacity to engage with the business and drive some of the change outcomes that the business may need to exploit some of the richer features that the public cloud platform may offer your business. So again, you may need to fund a bit of additional headcount capacity into a product team to support both the run requirements and some of the change requirements you need, and then be able to flex that up again, through your project and program change budgets on top of that. So again, your teams need to become and act more like developers. You need to focus on breaking down the silos and developing these multi-skilled, multidisciplinary teams. And you need to consider how you fund change and run within your technology organization. If we then look at the business, if I start with procurement, and obviously procurement would be involved in helping you select your preferred public cloud provider, ensuring the right contracts and so on are in place. One of the things that procurement teams don't understand, and again, this comes back down to lack of skill and knowledge at the outset, is that the cloud providers also provide a marketplace. And these marketplaces allow you to tap into a range of different technology products from a range of different vendors, some of which you might engage with today. And you can also procure professional services through those marketplaces as well. Now, procurement probably take an allergic reaction to that and see that as a backdoor to procurement. I can go and buy products and services without procurement ever knowing, and the cost for that just appears through my cloud provider bill at the end of each month. But you can use these marketplaces effectively to allow you to accelerate the delivery of change. You can control which products and services are available for your technology teams or business teams to consume through that marketplace. You can transfer some of the commercial terms that you've agreed today to the commercial terms that you pay through those marketplaces. So again, embracing those marketplaces in the right way with the right processes and controls can allow you to gain advantage and it not be exploited as a backdoor. If you look at finance, today, in a traditional world, procuring infrastructure is really, really easy. It's a capital expenditure translating to a straight line depreciation line on the balance sheet. In the future world, you're moving from this CapEx model to a variable OpEx model. And as a budget holder, and I've been a budget holder, it's incredibly challenging. So while you control the budget, in a lot of cases, you don't control the consumption. That consumption's probably been driven by other parts of the IT organization or by teams within the business. And quite quickly, you get into an incredibly uncomfortable position where you're trying to budget and forecast against something you don't control. And that might drive the need for your organization to consider implementing showback or chargeback to transfer some of the responsibility and accountability out to the teams that are driving that consumption and enable you to hold their feet to the fire a bit more. And then finally, internal audit. It might seem a bit of a strange one to have on the slide, but again, it's quite an important one. And certainly from my experience, working closely with internal audit from the outset can reap benefits. And again, like the other teams, there's a skills gap. The internal audit team will come along and want to ask some pretty pointed questions around how you're meeting your compliance to policies and regulations. There's a level of understanding of public cloud needs. There's a skills gap there. But also they might consider changes to the process. So again, I've talked about public cloud resources becoming quite transient in nature. I can provision resources today and terminate those in a month. But internal audit come along in 2 months' time and say, John, demonstrate to me that those resources were compliant with our policies and regulations when you were running those. How do I do that? I can't go and connect to that resource and show them because it no longer exists. So again, as an organization, it may drive you towards a more near real-time reporting requirement for your policies and regulations. And I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail when we talk about security and compliance. So again, this is just some examples of some of the changes you need to consider outside of the technology organization to allow you to deliver a successful cloud migration. If I drop into skills, and I recognize that skills is part of an operating model transformation, but given the challenge around skills, I felt it was best to kind of call this out separately. So I think, for those that are on the journey today or have come through the journey, I think we'd all recognize there's just not enough experience in the marketplace to satisfy the demand that we have. And whether you're the coolest startup, the largest enterprise, a managed service provider like Brightsolid, we all struggle to get access to the skill and experience we need at the time that we need it. And unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. You cannot magic that skill and experience, right? It's just not there today. It will grow over time, but it's not there today. But there are things that you can do to help navigate that challenge. Firstly, I recommend to every organization at the beginning of the journey, you need to source a small number of experienced cloud professionals. That could be through direct hires. It could be through a partner that you work with today. You're going to make some pretty fundamental decisions early on around your future target technology estate. You need to make sure these are no regret decisions. They're not going to come back and haunt you later, and these experts can help you navigate those successfully. Second, you need to recognise you're going to have to invest in a comprehensive learning and development programme, not just targeted at the technology teams, but the wider business. And that could be from the CEO all the way down to the engineering teams, and from technology across to finance and audit and procurement and elsewhere. The skill requirements of different teams will vary, so you need to recognise that. And particularly within the technology organisation, it's not just skills around the cloud provider of choice that you're using. There are a wider set of skills that your technology teams need as well. We've talked about them becoming more like developers. Skills around source code management, continuous integration, and writing good code will be a requirement as well. When you are going out to the market for skill, and you will need to do that to recruit talent, you need to recognise you're competing with everyone else. We're all fishing for experienced talent in a very, very small pond. How does your organisation stand out for the crowd? How do you ensure that the engineer that you're talking to through a recruitment process, how do they want to come and work for your organisation? What is it about your organisation that's going to attract them? How do you stand out from the crowd? How do you market your organisation to the candidates that you're trying to attract? Incredibly hard to do, but again, with the right focus and the right messaging, you can be successful. And then finally, you've spent all this time and energy in recruitment, you've invested heavily in learning and development, you've got the skills that you need within the organisation. How do you retain that? You need to factor retention into your sourcing strategy. Retention is incredibly hard, and I would argue probably harder than sourcing the talent in the first place. You're going to have to work hard at that. You're going to look at, what's going to keep the people that you've got, the skills you need working for your organisation. How are you going to continue to make your organisation attractive to them? So again, you need to think about retention from the outset to keep those people with you on the journey and then beyond. So that's skills. If we look at financial management, for those organisations that don't consider financial management as a core part of the cloud migration program, all I would say is prepare for bill shock. What do I mean by that? Your cloud provider bill is going to land over a month or a series of months, and it's going to blow your budget out of the water. It does happen. I've seen it happen time and time again. If you ignore financial management, you will experience bill shock at some point. Some of the challenges that you need to be aware of. We've talked about the shift from CapEx to OpEx and the challenges that means for the budget holder, particularly when the budget holder doesn't control the consumption because that's been driven by other parts of the organisation. Your cloud provider bills are going to become increasingly complex over time. And yes, you might be able to start with a spreadsheet to manage the bills that come in month on month, but these bills quickly ramp up to millions and millions of lines of line items. In an organisation I worked for, we'd migrated about 10% of our IT environment out to the cloud, and my cloud provider bill was 4 million line items a month. Hats off to anyone that can manage that in a spreadsheet. It becomes increasingly challenging to manage over time. You need to be able to account for every cloud resource that you run. And that's pretty straightforward to do. The cloud providers allow you to assign a tag to the resource, and that tag can identify the owner. So the name, typically a tag is a name value pair. The tag name could be owner, the value could be the business function, the name of the person could be an email address, something that allows you to identify the owner of that resource. You can also apply other tags to help with interpreting the bill. You can apply a cost center tag with the value being the cost center code. So you can apportion cost to cost centers going forward as well. What I would say is if you can't account for a resource, if you've enabled logging, audit logging, that can help you identify who created that resource. Worst case, switch off and see who shouts. Someone will always shout. Again, the resources you can't account for are driving spend and driving cost to your organisation. If you don't need them, switch them off. You're saving money. Automation and reporting, incredibly critical, particularly as your use of public cloud increases over time. You need to be able to use these tools to gain insight into your cloud provider bills. And ideally, you want to gain near real-time insight and identify anomalies in your spend over time. And that's really, really key because an anomaly can drive a significant unexpected spend quite quickly. And again, I've seen that happen time and time again. One recent example was an engineer that had cloned part of an environment. Part of that environment included a SQL Enterprise license. They did that on the third day of the month. The customer didn't know until the third day of the following month when their bill landed. And in that 30-day period, their cost had gone up by an unexpected £50,000. So that's a fairly significant cost to swallow as a budget holder. So again, with the right automation and reporting, you can get near real-time view of your cloud provider spend and any fluctuations. You can identify anomalies and take action a lot earlier to limit any unexpected spend. The reporting can also help facilitate some of the financial management processes you might need to support, and I'll come on to show back and charge back in a second. Proactive cost management. The cloud providers offer a range of levers that you can take advantage of to drive your monthly spend down. But you need the skills and tools within your organization to drive a proactive approach to cost optimization. That's going to require you to be able to digest complex billing data. You're going to have to blend that with machine telemetry to understand the usage of resource, combine that together to drive out a set of optimization strategies. And you're doing that on a regular basis. And sometimes you're doing that on a quarterly cadence. Show back and charge back. Again, I've talked about the challenge that exists as a budget holder and the benefit that show back and charge back can provide in terms of kind of delegating some of that accountability out to the stakeholders that are directly driving the consumption. Again, some of the automation and reporting, the ability to target, to assign cost center tags to resources can help facilitate that process. It's definitely something I think you should consider. The cloud providers, again, make this slightly more complex. They offer a set of levers, but again, being able to take advantage of these levers in the right way is a significant under challenge and requires a level of expertise, within the organization. And at a very, very basic level, you think if I'm running a cloud resource, that resource has a unit of charge. And at the end of the month, based on the usage, I get a bill. So the usage of charge, your unit of charge times the usage for that resource drives my monthly spend. And that typically drives what's called the on-demand spend. And that's the most expensive way in which you consume resource. There is another lever in terms of commitment. So I can commit to use a resource for a period of time. And in return for that commitment, the cloud provider will offer me a discount on that unit of charge. So again, some very, very simple levers, but it's not as simple as that. There are a number of other factors and levers that you need to be prepared to take advantage of. I've talked about on-demand on the right-hand side, back to the top right, being the most expensive way in which to consume resource. If you look at providers like, the main providers, if you look at reservations and sustained, so reservations is a term that AWS will use, sustained is a term that Google would use, and that's all around the commitment. In return for typically a 1 or a 3 year commitment, the cloud provider will offer me a discount somewhere in between 30 and 50% on the on-demand unit of charge. I always recommend organizations stick to a 1 year. There's very few use cases where you would go for 3, and I'll talk about why when I talk about generation as a lever in a few minutes. So again, take advantage of reservations or sustained. One of the others is spot. So again, AWS and Azure, they have the concept of spot. And what the cloud providers are doing there is that they have a lot of unused capacity in their data centers from time to time. And what they do is they offer that capacity at significantly discounted rates or a spot rate. And that spot rate can be 80 to 90% cheaper than the on-demand rates, so significant discounts. So you're wondering, why don't we all just use spot? The challenge you've got with spot is the cloud provider at some point will want that resource back because they can charge it at a higher rate. And what they do is they give you a 2-minute notice, and in 2 minutes time, they'll terminate that resource and they'll go and sell that to someone else at a higher rate. So your workload needs to be able to detect that termination notice and respond to that. And you can, but it requires a bit more upfront planning and may require a higher level of transformation of some of the workloads that you're moving to cloud. What I tend to see some organizations do is use a blend of these levers. So they might use, for a fleet of compute resources, a blend of on-demand, reservation, and spot to give them the outcome that they need. The other lever you want to look at is scheduling. Not all of your resources need to run 24 hours a day. If you think of your developers, they typically only work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So why not run the resources 8 to 6? That's 10 hours a day, 50 hours a week. That is reducing your cost by just over 2/3. Just by scheduling that resource only to run when you need it. Significant saving. It's not just development test. You might find there are production workloads that are maybe only used when the business are around. Why are you running them 24/7? Again, can you schedule those to only be available when they need the resource? And again, that can drive some significant savings if you can take advantage of scheduling as a lever. If I move on to the left-hand side of the slide, I'm going to pick on 2 or 3 of the levers you need to think about. The first one being foreign exchange or exchange rates. When your cloud bill is relatively small, you know, a fluctuation in exchange rates is neither here nor there, it's not material. But as your cloud bill grows over time, that could be to tens of thousands of dollars a month, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, or even more, a variation in exchange rate can have a material impact. And I've certainly experienced that again as a customer, where because of a fluctuation in exchange rate, my budget for the year was 80k adverse. And another year, actually, I've had 90k positive off the back of that, so it kind of worked in my favour. But again, working with your finance functions, you may want to look at how do you hedge that rate to build in a little bit of certainty around the FX element, because the cloud providers typically operate based on dollar. And if you're a UK organisation and you budget in pounds, you want a bit of certainty around that exchange rate going forward. Right sizing is another lever. And again, in a traditional world, when we provisioned or procured infrastructure, we normally bought infrastructure based on what we thought we might need in 5 years' time, based on a set of assumptions. In a lot of cases, these assumptions didn't pan out, and we had a lot of wasted capacity out there in the environment, but it was already sunk cost. It just sat there in the data center. In a public cloud world, you don't need to do that. You only need to provision what you need today. And it's very, very easy to add more capacity in the future as and when you need it. Obviously, that drives change around your capacity management process, but it can drive a significant benefit in cost. And again, if you look at the resources you're using today, if you've over provisioned, you can look to claw capacity back. And again, the very simple model that the cloud providers offer is their resources typically come in t-shirt sizes. You get small, medium, large, and extra large. If you're running a large resource today and it's over provisioned, you can right size that to a medium resource. By just doing a simple reboot to achieve that outcome, you're reducing the cost of that resource by 50%. Again, a significant saving. The final point in this slide is around generation or generational change. And again, I mentioned earlier that I always advise organizations not to commit to a 3-year commitment. This is the reason why. Normally every 15 to 18 months, the cloud providers will come out with the next generation of compute hardware or storage capability. And when they do that, that new generation typically gives you a boost in performance that comes at a cheaper cost. So by going from a generation 4 to a generation 5, as an example, I can get a boost in performance, but the cost of the resource typically drops somewhere between 5 and 15%. So again, by doing a reboot to get the next and latest generation, I get a double bubble of benefit. I get more performance at a 5 to 15% reduction in cost. So again, the reason for sticking to a 1 year is to allow you to take advantage of that lever when appropriate. So again, it's incredibly complex, and I recognize that it's not for the faint-hearted. But I guess failure to recognize the need to invest in financial management at the outset will result, as I've said, it will result in bill shock. You will hit bill shock at some point pretty quickly. And in my experience, organizations that don't take advantage of financial management typically pay a 30% premium, at least a 30% premium on their monthly cloud spend. And that premium will only increase over time as you start to consume more and more of that public cloud platform and the resources on offer. But help is available. If you're an enterprise support customer with a public cloud provider, go and talk to your account team. They are there to help you. And certainly when I was a customer, I would sit down with my account team on a monthly basis, and they would come to the table with opportunities for me to save money. All right. To begin with, it feels a bit alien. You've got a supplier that's coming to the table to convince you to spend less money with them. They do mean that. A lot of these individuals are incentivized more in the long-term relationship with you rather than this year's financial target. So they want you to spend less because ultimately you'll do more with them in the long term. The public cloud providers do provide tools that you can leverage to gain insight into your monthly spend and to gain insight into where you can exploit some of the optimization levers that I've talked about. There are also a range of third-party tools out there as well that can offer increased levels of sophistication, deeper levels of insight, and maybe give you an impartial view of some of the optimization levers as well. The third option is to outsource it. There are managed service providers out there that deliver financial management as a service. They will give you the insight that you need on a regular basis around your monthly cloud spend, and they will come to the table on a regular basis to advise you on how best to optimize your resource to ensure you're paying the minimum amount possible each month to your cloud provider. So again, outsourcing is an option. So again, that's financial management. It's incredibly complex. It's going to drive the need for new skills in the organization. You need skills to be able to interpret your cloud provider bill. You need the analytics skills and the data analytics skills to bring that cloud provider data together with your machine telemetry data, mash that together to drive the insight and meaning to allow you to shrink that spend over time. Again, I wouldn't underestimate the skill and capability you need to be successful in that. If you then move to security and compliance, this is kind of the last area I wanted to focus on this morning. And again, as I've mentioned, security and compliance is becoming less of a blocker today. Certainly when I started working with organizations in the early day, you know, the shutters came right down from the security teams. When you started to talk about public cloud, it was seen as being insecure, but the public cloud providers spend way more on security than most organizations can ever dream of. However, you need to recognize there's a level of shared responsibility when it comes to adopting public cloud services. Regardless of whether you're working with Microsoft, whether you're working with Google, or you're working with AWS, the same responsibility model holds true. The cloud provider, yes, they're accountable for the physical data center, locations, you know, the compute network and storage resources that they host in these data centers, the software layers that maybe deliver the hypervisor or some of the platform and software services. Yes, they have an accountability, and they can evidence that accountability to you through attestation reports that you can request as and when you require. But above that line, the responsibility shifts to you as a customer. So if you're provisioning a virtual machine in that public cloud environment, there is an obligation on you to ensure that that virtual machine is secure. The operating system is hardened, it's patched on a regular basis, it's backed up, it's patched. The teams that need access to that are doing so in a controlled manner, segregating privileged access for non-privileged access. The firewall rules that allow that resource to talk to your customers or to other internal systems, again, you're accountable for the configuration of that. So as the customer, you are responsible for ensuring you've got the right mix of security and compliance controls to protect the systems and data that you're putting into the cloud. The good news is the public cloud providers do provide a range of tools and services that you can take advantage of to help with that. But again, you need the skill and knowledge in your organization to use these features in the right way. Unfortunately, if you get it wrong, your systems and data could be compromised. And there are examples out there, unfortunately, where organizations have got this wrong. And just to pick on one example, and this is from around about a year ago, this was a care home operator based in England that was using the public cloud object storage service. And when they'd configured that service, they weren't encrypting data at rest. And the service had been configured to be publicly accessible. So what does that mean? It means that anyone that knew the website URL for that object storage location could pop that into any web browser and see all of the files and download and view those files locally. And those files had confidential patient data. So again, unfortunately for this organization, front page of the press as a result of this, and I'm sure a lot of unwanted attention from the Information Commissioner in the process. But you can avoid these mistakes. To do that, you need to establish a strong set of controls at the outset of your cloud migration journey. And those controls form part of your cloud control framework. And these will allow you to avoid the mistakes that others have made. The control framework that you implement needs to consider both technical and non-technical controls. The technical controls being identity and access management, how do your teams get secure access and kind of least privileged based access to the cloud provider platform, ensuring your data is encrypted at rest, having audit logging in place so you can understand who's done what, where and when. But there's also a set of non-technical controls you need to factor into that as well. Contract management. You know, anyone can go and sign up to one of the cloud providers using a credit card and just sign up to their online T's and C's. Those online T's and C's might not be enough for your business. For example, if you're a financial services organization, there are a set of guidelines that you need to meet that stipulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. The cloud providers offer a financial services addendum to their contract. Do you need to have that in place as part of your overall contract with that provider? There are other aspects around risk management and governance and oversight, again, that you will need to consider. The controls that you implement will likely be preventative or detective. So preventative, by that I mean the control will stop a developer from making a mistake. Or detective is the developer can still make the mistake, but you've got a way of detecting that and alerting the right people so they can intervene and take action on a timely basis. But I guess what I would say is you need to implement the framework at the outset. It is incredibly difficult to retrofit a control framework to an existing cloud environment. I've been there and seen it. In some cases, implementing the framework retrospectively can actually break what you've already deployed. And in some cases, you may need to start again and then look to migrate again the workloads to this new landing zone that has the controls baked in from the outset. So again, get it right at the outset, it pays dividends down the line. So these are the controls, but what does the technical implementation of the control look like? How do we actually stop a developer making a mistake, like the developer saying that care home operator? The implementation of these controls form what I call a guardrail. And the guardrails are there to make it really, really easy for the developers to do the right thing. And you want to be able to do that without causing any unnecessary friction. And if you take the analogy of the bridge on the slide, when the engineers and architects designed the bridge, this was a straight path from one side of the river to the next. It was the most optimal path across the river. But when they designed that, they recognized that without the guardrails or the railings on either side of the bridge, there was a risk of me falling off the edge as I was going across and maybe injuring myself in the process. So the guardrails in that analogy apply to the implementation of cloud-based services. You want to make it really, really easy for the developers to do the right thing and do that in a frictionless way, but keep them safe in the process. But what does that look like? So we take a simple control, and again, building on the care home operator, if we want to ensure that all data is encrypted at rest at all times, and to do that, we need to use encryption keys. So therefore, we need a key management policy that's defined and enforced. That's a great definition of a control. What would the guardrails look like? And again, in this example, I've got 3 components of the guardrail. The first one is, and I mentioned earlier, the cloud providers can help. They've got features and services that you can take advantage of. And in this example, I'm going to use 2. I'm going to use a key management service that defines the ownership and use of encryption keys and the automated rotation of these keys on a regular basis, just like you would do with a password. I'm also going to use an identity and access management policy to control who can use the key to encrypt and decrypt data, but also who can actually create encryption keys in the first place. I can control that as well. So that's the first part of the guardrail that I'm going to implement. The second part I'm going to implement, again, I want to make this really, really easy for my developers to do the right thing. So through my cloud engineering product team, I'm going to give my developers an infrastructure as code platform, which they can use to provision a virtual machine that by default has the storage encrypted at rest using encryption keys that comply with my policy. Great. I've made it easy for the developers. However, there's always the risk that the developers will go off-piste. Perhaps they're dealing with a new use case, and to tackle that use case, they've done what most developers maybe do. They'll go and do a Google search. Someone's bound to have solved that before. They've got a code snippet from whoever solved it before, and they've tried to run that in your environment. And by doing so, that code snippet doesn't encrypt data. And before you know it, you've got a lot of unencrypted resources out there. So this is where the third pillar of my guardrail comes in. And this is a compliance engine. So my compliance engine is monitoring my cloud environment on a real-time basis. And there are rules within that engine that detect when a virtual machine is launched. They check if the storage is encrypted and the keys comply with my key management policy. And if the answer is no, it automatically terminates that virtual machine, notifies the developer of their error, and hopefully the developer will go and then fix their code, run it through a second time, and it'll be successful. The other advantage of this approach, and again, if I go back to the operating model change and the impact on internal audit, I've now got a near real-time view of compliance to my controls and policies. So internal audit can self-serve, but it also gives them that historic view. So in a couple of months' time, if that resource no longer exists, the auditor can see that I was continually compliant with those policies, or at least they can see where the exceptions are, and we can interrogate those in specific detail. So again, this approach helps me to make it easy for my developers to do the right thing, but protect the organization in the process as well. And finally, when it comes to controls and compliance, with the right control framework, you can start to map these to some of the international standards and regulations that you might need to meet as an organization. So this is an example control from our control framework. The control area being data security, the control description around encryption data at rest, so the example that we've just used in the previous slide, description of the risk I'm trying to mitigate, the guardrails that I've used to implement that control, and then how that control maps to the various annexes within ISO 27001, or the cloud security principles from the National Cybersecurity Centre. Again, you can map that to that, and again, it will help you evidence that when it comes to external audit or internal audit conversations. So, coming to the end of the talk this morning, I guess for me, what are some of the key takeaways that I'd like you to kind of walk away with? The first one, and the key important one, is a cloud migration program is way more than just a technology change. It's not just about moving resources from a data center to a cloud provider. There are fundamental changes that impact the operating model and the ways of working within an organization. And it's not just a technology function. These are changes that will impact other parts of the business as well. There's organisational change, there's investment in skills, there's changes to processes, procedures, and potentially new processes and tools required as well. Skills enablement, significant challenge. There's not enough experience in the marketplace to satisfy the demand. How are you going to tap into the small pool of experts you need to help you early on in the journey? How are you going to build the capability within your organisation? And as I've said, retention is just as important as sourcing of resource. So how are you going to ensure that resource stays with your organisation for the kind of the medium term? Financial management, again, please factor that into your cloud migration program. You want to avoid bill shock. I've seen a lot of organizations suffer from that. I recognize there's a lot of complexity in managing cloud spend and optimizing that spend to ensure that you spend the minimum amount possible each month. It's worth the investment. Again, if you don't believe you can do that within the organization, look for help. You've got your cloud provider, but you can also look to outsource that as well. There are organizations that will deliver that to you as a service. And then finally, security and compliance. Again, think about the control framework and the controls, the key controls that you need to implement at the outset. Think about the guardrails that you need to implement to enforce those controls within your environment to allow your developers to be productive, but also to protect the systems and data that you are migrating to public cloud. So that brings me to the end of my talk this morning. I want to thank you for listening and now happy to open up for questions.